The chapel remained silent long after the final whispered, "Amen." The candle still flickered. The echo of their prayer lingered, not in words, but in presence. Jonathan stood first, slowly, reverently. His knees were sore, but his heart felt lighter, not because a burden had been lifted, but because he no longer carried it alone. The Pope rose beside him, and for the first time since their awkward public encounter, there was no tension between them, only peace. Pope Leo XIV turned and gestured toward a wooden side door. "Come," he said quietly, "before the press finds us." They exited through a narrow hallway lined with portraits of past popes, centuries of solemn faces, framed in gold and shadow. Jonathan glanced at each one as they passed. Men who had shaped history, men both adored and misunderstood. And now here he was, walking beside one of them, not as a character, not as a performer, but as a man. They reached a small private garden enclosed by stone walls. A fountain bubbled gently in the center. Orange blossoms filled the air with a quiet sweetness. Here, away from the clamor of the city, they sat again, on a stone bench, under an olive tree. The Pope turned to Jonathan, his voice softened by the morning air. "I want to apologize," he said. Jonathan looked up. Leo continued, "Not just for that moment on the tarmac, but for judging you too quickly, for fearing what I didn't understand. I saw the crowds cheering you, and I thought, this is dangerous, but what I missed was that you never asked for any of it." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I didn't, and some days, I still don't know how to carry it." The Pope smiled gently. "You carry it by surrendering it. Day by day, the world will keep lifting you up, or tearing you down. That is not your business. Your business is to remain faithful." Jonathan looked out over the garden. The world beyond those walls felt distant now, almost like another lifetime. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he whispered. "I just wanted to tell the story. And you have," Leo replied. "But now, your story is being written, too." He paused, then added, "People see Jesus when they look at you, Jonathan. That's a heavy thing. But it also means they are looking. They are searching." Jonathan thought of the people he'd met, the letters, the weeping fans, the broken hearts, who saw hope, not in him, but through him. He whispered, "It's not about me." The Pope smiled. "Exactly." A long pause. Then, Pope Leo XIV leaned forward and reached for Jonathan's hand. This time, he didn't hesitate. He took it, held it firmly. No cameras, no crowd, no performance, just grace. A man of the cloth. And a man of the screen. Joined by something eternal. The Pope looked him in the eye and said something Jonathan would never forget. "Let them see Christ in you, but never mistake you for him." Jonathan swallowed hard. He would carry that for the rest of his life. As they stood to return to the palace, the Pope added one last word, almost in a whisper. "Keep burning, candle, quietly, faithfully." Back through the halls they walked, but something had changed. Jonathan no longer felt like a guest. He felt sent. As the heavy doors opened to the world again, the press was waiting. Cameras, microphones, questions shouted in 5 languages. Flashes lit up. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't wave. He didn't pose. He simply turned to the Pope and bowed, and Pope Leo XIV, in front of all the world, stepped forward, smiled gently, and embraced him. A hug. No politics, no power. Just one man honoring another. It was a moment no camera could fully capture, because what had happened in that Vatican meeting wasn't news. It was holy. And later, when reporters asked what the two had spoken about, neither offered details, but Jonathan said this: "We talked about light, and how to carry it." That single line went viral. Not for drama, but for the truth behind it. In the weeks that followed, audiences began rewatching The Chosen, not just as entertainment, but as invitation. Churches used clips to stir hearts. Families gathered around the television, not for escape, but for encounter, and quietly, across the world, candles were lit, one by one. Because when a man refuses to take glory for himself, and points instead to something higher, people remember. They remember the silence, the stillness, the sacred dot. And somewhere in a little chapel inside the Vatican, that same candle Jonathan had been given still burns, unmarked, uncelebrated, but faithful like the man who carried it out into a world that desperately needed light, and kept walking, not as Jesus, but as a man who had seen him and would never be the same. The air in the Pope's private study was still, thick with unspoken words. But something had shifted. Not in the headlines, not in the noise, but between two souls. Jonathan gently released the Pope's hand. He could feel the tremble in Leo's fingers, not from weakness, but weight, burden, reverence. The Pope gestured to a pair of simple wooden chairs by the window. No thrones, no ornate cushions, just two chairs. They sat, no cameras, no notes, just truth, and it was the Pope who spoke first. You must wonder why I turned away that day. Jonathan nodded slowly, but said nothing. Leo exhaled. When I saw you, not on the stage, not on the screen, but in person, I saw something that shook me. A man burdened with an image the world had given him. A man who didn't ask to become a symbol. He looked out the window. The church has always wrestled with symbols. Jonathan, icons, saints, prophets. But when the people give that title to someone who hasn't sought it, someone from outside our walls, we get uncomfortable, afraid. Jonathan finally spoke. I'm not him, he said quietly. I know, Leo replied. But you've become a window. And some people would rather look at the frame than the light that shines through it. Silence. Not a cold silence. A holy one. The Pope turned his gaze back toward Jonathan. Do you know what startled me the most that day? Jonathan shook his head. You didn't flinch when I turned away. You didn't react. You just bowed your head. Like a man who had already suffered. Jonathan swallowed. Because I have. Leo studied him, and for the first time, he saw what the headlines never could. The exhaustion behind the eyes. The scars beneath the faith. The burden of being worshipped by millions. For portraying the one who was crucified. Tell me, the Pope asked gently, what has the role taken from you? Jonathan hesitated, then answered. My anonymity, he began. My quiet. My illusions. My comfort. My ability to walk through a crowd without people weeping or calling me Messiah. He paused, his voice cracked. And sometimes, my peace. The Pope's expression softened, and he reached for a small wooden cross on the side table. He turned it over in his hands. You have carried a kind of cross most don't recognize, he said, and yet, you keep carrying it. I try. Leo leaned forward. But do you know why I asked you here, Jonathan? Not just to explain myself, but because I believe your cross might also be your calling. Jonathan looked up, surprised, moved, confused. The Pope continued. Actors come and go. Stories rise and fade. But every generation, God chooses strange messengers. Unlikely ones. Tax collectors, fishermen, even actors. He smiled faintly. And when the world sees one of its own reflect back the light, even faintly, it starts to tremble. Not because the actor is perfect, but because the reflection is real. Jonathan's throat tightened. He hadn't come expecting affirmation. He hadn't come seeking redemption. But somehow, in this quiet room, something deeper was unfolding. A calling being named. The Pope stood and walked to a cabinet. From it, he pulled out a small, carefully wrapped object. He returned and handed it to Jonathan. A candle hand poured. Plain wax. No markings. Leo looked him in the eyes. This is what you are now, he said. Not the fire, not the altar, but the candle, quietly burning, giving light. Jonathan held it carefully, like something sacred. And then unexpectedly, Leo knelt beside him. Not fully, just enough to make Jonathan lean forward, startled. Your generation, Leo said, has lost many of its priests, but it hasn't lost its hunger. And somehow, God has chosen you to feed the starving with stories. Jonathan blinked. Overwhelmed, he wanted to speak, to deflect, to deny, to make a joke, but something stopped him. Tears welled in his eyes. Not from ego, but recognition. Recognition of something he'd been wrestling with in silence for years. That his work was not just art, it was ministry. Not in the traditional sense, but in a language this generation still understood. Story, truth, wrapped in flesh. Like a parable, like an echo. The Pope rose and placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. And then, with unexpected joy, he said, Come with me. They walked not to the basilica, not to the crowd, but to a quiet chapel inside the Vatican. One few ever see. Inside, a single candle burned, and there, beside that flickering flame, Pope Leo XIV did something no one expected. He invited Jonathan to pray with him. Side by side. On their knees. No robes, no script, just a priest and a man who played Christ, both looking toward the real one. And outside, as the sun began to rise over Rome, a new story was beginning. Not on a screen, but in the hearts of two men who had finally seen each other clearly and understood. The storm didn't come from Rome, it came from everywhere else. The video clip, only a few seconds long, was shared, dissected, and magnified across social media like wildfire. People zoomed in, slowed it down, rewound it frame by frame. Some defended the Pope. Others stood with Jonathan, and most were just stunned. How could such a devout, faithful man, someone who had brought so many back to their faith, be treated like that? But Jonathan didn't say a word. No tweets, no interviews, no press statements. He stayed silent, and somehow, that silence spoke louder than any headline. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, questions began to stir. Among the Pope's advisors, confusion spread. No explanation had been given. No notes in the official briefing. No planned gesture or non-gesture. It wasn't protocol to snub. And yet, the Pope had turned. Some whispered, "He's old. Maybe he didn't see the hand." Others wondered, was it intentional? A silent judgment on the show, on Hollywood. But there was one man, a quiet, gray-haired priest, who had served the church since before Jonathan was born, who wasn't satisfied with theories. Father Matteo. He had served as one of Pope Leo's theological advisors for over a decade. He had known the man before the mitre, before the name change, before the weight of the papacy had curved his back and sharpened his eyes. And that evening, as the sun fell behind the rooftops of Vatican City, Father Matteo knocked on the papal study's heavy wooden door. The Pope looked up from his desk. "You've heard the noise?" Father Matteo asked gently. Leo didn't answer at first, just stared into the dark wood grain of his desk. Then, finally, he said, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Matteo stepped closer. "Then why didn't you shake his hand?" The Pope's eyes shifted, not defensive, but tired, worn. "Because I wasn't ready," he whispered. There was a pause, and then he added, "That young man, he carries something I haven't seen in a long time." Matteo frowned. "You mean the role?" "No," Leo said. "The burden." He rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the basilica dome glowed beneath the moonlight. "Do you know how many people see him as Christ?" the Pope asked, his voice heavy. "Not just an actor, but more." Father Matteo nodded slowly. "He didn't ask for it," the Pope continued, "but they've given it to him. The reverence, the longing, the projection of hope. That's dangerous. For them, for him. You feared that. I feared what it would do to his soul." But instead, Matteo trailed off. Leo nodded. Double quotes instead. "I saw a man who had suffered, who had been humbled, who didn't flinch when I turned away." There was silence between them. And then the Pope said something that startled even Matteo. "I didn't shake his hand, because I didn't feel worthy." It was not guilt, it was awe. Somewhere, in the middle of the fame, the robes, the media, noise, and the Vatican politics, Pope Leo XIV had glimpsed something in Jonathan that made him hesitate. He had expected a performer. He found something closer to a disciple. But now the silence had been misread, the moment distorted, and the Pope knew he had to set it right, not with a press release, but with an invitation. Meanwhile, Jonathan had returned to the States. He avoided the talk shows, ignored the drama, focused on prayer. He spoke to his pastor, to his spiritual director, even to his parents. He told them what happened, but not how much it had shaken him. He had forgiven the moment, but it stayed with him. The weight in the Pope's eyes, the unanswered gesture, not because it wounded his pride, because he felt something pass between them. In that moment, something neither could name. Weeks passed. Then one day, a white envelope arrived at his doorstep, hand-delivered. Unmarked, save for a gold-embossed seal, the insignia of the Holy See. Jonathan opened it. His hands trembled as he read, "You are formally invited to a private audience with His Holiness Pope Leo XIV. The Pope requests a conversation, not as pontiff to actor, but as brother to brother." There was no camera crew this time, no press announcement, no pomp. Just Jonathan, quietly returning to the city that had once stunned him into silence. He wore the same navy suit, but this time, he brought something with him. A worn leather Bible, its pages marked and frayed, its corners bent, a gift from his grandfather. It had traveled with him through auditions, hospital visits, and long nights of doubt. He tucked it under his arm as he stepped once more into the apostolic palace. The hallway was just as silent, the guards just as still, but the room he entered this time was smaller, simpler, and when the door opened, the Pope stood alone. No aides, no secretaries, no microphones. He looked tired, but warmer, older, but softer. Jonathan bowed again, but before he could rise, the Pope stepped forward, and this time he extended his hand. Jonathan looked at it for a second longer than expected. Then he grasped it. Firm, gentle, true. They didn't speak at first. They just stood there. Two men, one with a crown of thorns stitched into his soul, the other with the weight of Peter's keys on his back. And slowly, the walls began to fall. Nobody expected it. Not the cameras, not the crowd, not even Jonathan Roumie himself. It was supposed to be a moment of deep reverence, a sacred encounter between the man who had become the face of Jesus for millions, and the spiritual leader of over 1 billion faithful. Rome shimmered that morning beneath a golden haze. St. Peter's Square stood still, holding its breath like it had so many times in history. Jonathan waited, hands clasped at his front, eyes downcast. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to honor. But what happened next would ripple through every corner of the Christian world. When Jonathan extended his hand to Pope Leo XIV, the pontiff paused, their eyes locked. And then, nothing. No handshake, no acknowledgement. Just a heavy silence, followed by a quiet, unmistakable turn away. The cameras clicked, the murmurs began, and in that instant, confusion, embarrassment, and something else entirely, something deeper washed across Jonathan's face. The world would go on to ask why. Was it a statement, an accident, a condemnation? But the truth lay far beyond that one moment. To understand what really happened, you'd have to go back before the robes, before the robe, before the weight of it all rested on Jonathan's shoulders. He was just a struggling actor then, living in a small apartment in New York, working odd jobs, skipping meals some nights. His dreams were crumbling faster than his bank account. The auditions were rare, the callbacks rarer. He often prayed. Sometimes he wept, sometimes both. There was a moment, just one, when he stood on a city sidewalk, palms open to the sky, and whispered, "God, if this isn't where you want me, take it away." But nothing was taken. Instead, something was given. A script, a role, an invitation to audition for a legit, crowdfunded series that nobody in Hollywood took seriously. The role, Jesus of Nazareth. He almost walked away. Too big, too holy, too much. But something pulled him back. There was a stillness in the writing, a depth, and something in his heart cracked open. He took the role, and the chosen was born. No one expected. What came next? The series exploded, in ways no one predicted, across countries, languages, denominations. People who hadn't prayed in years suddenly felt something again, something alive. And Jonathan, whether he wanted it or not, became a symbol. People cried when they met him. They reached for his hands. They asked for prayers, for blessings, even forgiveness. He didn't know how to carry it. He wasn't Jesus. He knew that, but something about the role, it had changed him. Not just the lines or the costume. Something inside. He began praying more, reading scripture like it was water for his soul. Fasting, listening, wrestling. It stopped being a performance. It became transformation. So when the Vatican extended an invitation for him to meet Pope Leo XIV, it wasn't about publicity. It was pilgrimage. He arrived in Rome quietly. No reporters, no fanfare. Just a single suitcase and a rosary in his pocket. He wore a plain navy suit. Not even a tie. He entered the apostolic palace with trembling hands and a steady heart. The marble hallway was cold and gleaming. Papal guards stood like statues. A hush lingered in the air like incense. Jonathan could hear the echo of his own breath as he was led to the private meeting chamber. And then, the doors opened. There he was, Pope Leo XIV. Tall, solemn, wrapped in white. His presence filled the room without sound. A man who carried centuries of tradition in the quiet set of his jaw. Jonathan stepped forward. He smiled. He bowed his head respectfully, then extended his hand. The Pope looked at it, then at him, and simply turned. No words, no touch, only silence. It was as if the entire room exhaled all at once, and then said nothing. Jonathan stood there, his hand still half lifted, before slowly lowering it. He didn't flinch. He didn't frown. But the flicker in his eyes said enough. No one spoke. No one dared. The moment passed. But it didn't fade. It burned into the air like a flash of lightning. Sudden, sharp, and unforgettable. Later, the headlines would spin their versions. Pope shuns Jesus actor. Snub at the Vatican. Was Roumie rejected? Speculation exploded. Was it a misunderstanding? Was there tension between tradition and television? Did the Pope disapprove of the chosen? No one had answers. Not yet. What the world didn't see was what happened after Jonathan, silent, walked out into the Roman sunlight. He found a bench near a fountain, and sat there for over an hour. Alone. Not angry. Not ashamed. Just still. His hands rested in his lap. He looked up at the towering dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and he didn't pray for justice or vindication. Simply whispered, "Lord, teach me." Because even after portraying Jesus for years, he was still learning what it meant to follow him. This was part of it. The misunderstanding. The public silence. The quiet humiliation. Not because it was fair, but because it was real. And maybe that was the lesson. Maybe this was the cost of carrying a cross that didn't belong to you, but shaped you anyway. What Jonathan didn't know was that something deeper had been set in motion that day. That the silence in that hole would soon break into something no one saw coming. Not even the Pope himself. Because this story wasn't over. It was just beginning.